Continued from the previous file, Literary Types Tragedy, page 26, question 11. Comment on the interplay between free will and predestination in tragedy, or from the tragedies you have read, can you come to any general conclusion about the extent to which a tragic hero is responsible for his downfall? Answer. There is a common fallacy that Shakespeare's tragedies are tragedies of character as distinguished from the Greek tragedies, which are the tragedies of fate. The idea seems to be that in Shakespeare, the catastrophe is due to the inevitable operation of character and circumstances, while in the Greek dramas, the catastrophe is brought about by some extra cosmic force not amenable to human reason and will. It is suggested that the tragedy of Oedipus is not due to any fault of the character, but due to mighty and impalpable force higher than him. But Macbeth's tragedy is due to his ambition. Othello's jealousy is responsible for his tragedy. Hamlet's reflective habit and Lear's impetuosity have brought about their tragedy. But nothing is more futile and misleading than this distinction between Shakespearean tragedy and Greek tragedy. It is true that the hero of a Shakespearean tragedy has a flaw in his character, hamartia in Greek tragedy. But this flaw is not fatal by itself, or it is not a defect at all. It becomes a defect, and that defect becomes fatal in the circumstances in which he is placed. Macbeth is ambitious, Othello is jealous, Hamlet is given to reflection. These tendencies are not at all tragic in the ordinary circumstances. They become tragic because the circumstances which these heroes confront, the particular circumstances in which the heroes are placed, aggravate the defects which again worsen the circumstances, and thus impossible situations are created for them. Fate operates in their life in the form of chances and coincidences. Macbeth meets the witches at a psychological moment, and again Duncan visits the castle at a fatal hour. The dropping of handkerchief by Desdemona has an important role to play in the rousing of frenzied jealousy in Othello, which accounts for his tragedy. Moreover, there is an unmistakable impression that the heroes are swayed by an overmastering passion or force which they cannot control in spite of their noble nature. There is a marked one-sidedness in the heroes, but we have a feeling that the impulse which seduces him is stronger, far more potent than his better nature. It is therefore not true to say that the hero alone is responsible for his tragedy, or in other words, that character is destiny. Page 27. A mighty and impalpable force, call it fate or destiny or providence, drives the hero relentlessly to his doom. Shakespeare believes in both responsibility and faith. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. Unquote. From Julius Caesar. Quote, there is a divinity that shapes our end. Rough you them how you will. Unquote. From Hamlet. Quote, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. Unquote. From King Lear. In Greek tragedy, fate is the predominant force that guides the heroes to their tragic dooms. Aristotle says that hamartia, in bracket error of judgment, bracket closed, is to some extent responsible for the tragedy. But what is hamartia in Oedipus except that he tries to escape fate? Ultimately, he is laid low and is overwhelmed by fate. It is his fate which is proclaimed long before that he would murder his father and marry his wife. Similarly, fate overwhelms Antigone and Agamemnon. In the tragic novels of Thomas Hardy, fate predominates. Hardy's novels deal with the sufferings and calamities of characters. Although the sufferings follow from the defects of the characters, yet there is an impression that the characters are borne down by the terrible forces operating through nature, chance and fate. Henchard, Tess, Oak, Troy, Eustacia, their characters are to some extent responsible for their tragedy, but fate broods on them like a pall of gloom and overpowers them. They are shown as ranged against impersonal forces which they cannot resist. There is not even any trace of resistance on the part of the characters against these forces. The heroic resistance, which is the main attraction of tragedy, and which we see in Greek tragedy and Shakespearean tragedy. Tess is knocked about by fate, which appears in the form of accidents, chances, and double standards of social morality in the Victorian age. Henchard is impulsive, but his tragedy is the product of chances, coincidences, and natural accidents. Hardy believes in determinism. Henchard has provoked Nemesis by his moral crime in the sale of his wife. Nemesis dogs him and humiliates him materially and mentally under the moral order is restored. Professor Bradley holds the view that, quote, character is destiny, unquote, quote, the exaggeration of a vital truth, unquote. But this view cannot be accepted. Dr. Smart, in his essay on tragedy, in bracket essays and studies, bracket closed, remarks quite rightly, quote, of the two theories, those of fate and responsibility, page 28. He, in bracket Shakespeare, bracket closed, perceives that both, each in its own place, have in them something of truth, that both correspond to indubitable realities of life, unquote. The hero suffers an inner havoc caused by the conjunction of evils from within and from without. A mighty, inscrutable power, stronger than all his imaginative perceptions and moral scruples, seems to guide him relentlessly to the path which he wants to avoid in vain. There is the same overwhelming sense of fate working on Macbeth and other Shakespearean heroes as it works on Oedipus and Agamemnon in Greek tragedy, and Henchard and Gabriel Oak in Hardy's tragic novels. Question 12. What in your view is more important in tragedy, plot or character? Discuss with reference to some typical tragedies. Answer. Aristotle gives pride of place to plot in a tragedy. He divides tragedy into 6 constituents: plot, character, thought, diction, melody, and spectacle. Of all these, the most important is the combination of incidents. Quote, because tragedy is an imitation not of men but of action of life, which consists in action and its end, it's not a quality but a mode of action, unquote. Only through such action life becomes happy or unhappy. Character is only subsidiary to action. Aristotle here makes an observation which has provoked a controversy. Quote, without action there cannot be a tragedy. There may be without manner, in bracket, or character, bracket closed, unquote. Those parts of tragedy, there may be powerful emotional interest in tragedy. Peripeteia or reversal of the situation and anagnorisis or discovery scenes are parts of the fable or plot. Aristotle thus points the way to a distinction between two kinds of tragedy, tragedy of action and tragedy of character. If he gives primacy to the former, his reasons are philosophical rather than aesthetic. A successful tragedy must combine plot, character, and thought in a harmonious manner. We cannot think of a drama or a novel that does not have both plot and character, which are intertwined. It is worthwhile quoting Henry James's comment, quote, what is character but the determination of incident? What is incident but the illustration of character? Unquote. If plot and character are interdependent and also equally essential, so in thought, which gives vitality to the other constituent parts of a work of art. In a successful tragedy, the incidents should issue out of characters, and the behavior of the characters should be governed by the development of incidents. There is no scope for autonomous characters and extraneous situations in a good drama. There must be organic, page 29. Connection between characters and situations. The particular behavior of characters should create situations, and situations would follow one another in logical succession. In short, there must be cause and effect relationship between the incidents as well as between the characters and incidents. It is true that a plot implies necessarily the arrangement of the incidents of story as well as of feelings and passions incidental to the story in order to produce a certain effect. A work of art is a symbolic pattern of life. It has not life's perpetual tendency to overflow prescribed limits and behave in unpredictable ways. The question is, which is the more important symbol for tragedy, the plot or the way in which things happen or character? The answer is, plot and character together constitute what is called action. Aristotle thinks that character is realized in action. Bonamy Dobry, in his essay on Thomas Hardy, thinks that tragedy is related to how things happen in life because, in the first place, the object of tragedy is to show how insignificant man proves himself in the face of heavy odds ranged against him which he cannot control. And secondly, because tragedy is concerned not with the problems of the individual man, but with matters of universal fate. Character which relates to the individual man is thus incidental to the plot. Characters are necessary to the plot because they alone give to the pattern the semblance of the life which tragedy symbolizes. The pattern of the story reflects the tragic view of life, while characters make the pattern something living and therefore true. Tragedy postulates a deterministic view of life. Necessity plays an important part in the development of the action of tragedy. The end of the hero who has committed a folly or crime is determined because the hero must suffer for his hubris. Nemesis follows hubris. Thus, the pattern is set. There is no escape from fate. Thus, the characters are regimented within the framework of a predetermined plot. Hardy, for example, arranges his incidents artificially with an emphasis on blind casualty. The characters are called upon to fulfill the destiny that the plot imposes on them. As a result, characters become lifeless and wooden. In a good tragedy, necessity and freedom coexist. Characters will rush to a predetermined destiny, but at the same time they must show their free will. They must show their assertive energy. Heroic resistance against fate is the hallmark of a good tragedy. Oedipus's fate is predetermined. He will kill his father and marry, page 30, his mother. That is the prophecy of the oracle. But his meeting with Laius is a chance coincidence, and he freely treads the path chalked out for him when he kills Laius or marries Jocasta. The revelation which comes in its own time comes naturally and is yet artfully devised by the dramatist. In spite of the fact that the end is predetermined, the story is thrilling because it tells us, quote, of carnal, bloody and unnatural acts of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, unquote, that come freely and yet necessarily. Macbeth has to pay the penalty for his vaulting ambition. His end is known from the beginning, but his desperateness against fate creates further problems for him and hastens his downfall. There is the impression that Macbeth is guided more by his overmastering passion than by the fate above and beyond himself. It is a fine example of the interplay of necessity and freedom. The relationship between character and plot in most great tragedy is so intimate that we speak of the inevitability of a series of events in this form, and of the particular challenge confronting the end to which he comes as part of his fate. A man's fate, like his character, is usually the shape or result of a collaboration between forces working from within and from without. Although every tragedy worth the name must have all the three constituents, plot, character and thought, they will differ from one another as one or the other of these elements become predominant. There is no paucity of action in Shakespeare, but his dramas, particularly his tragedies, are dramas of character rather than of incidents. A large number of world's tragedies, Shakespeare's most preeminently, are tragedies of character. Although Aristotle was right in his insistence on the need for action as an indispensable ingredient, he was wrong in claiming that the plot is the soul of all tragedies. In many of Maeterlinck's plays, for example, action has been reduced to the minimum, and all the emphasis is on the half-hidden recesses of the human heart. Although the appeal of Greek tragedy is derived largely from concentrated action, the plot is not always the focus of interest. The Oedipus Tyrannus is more a tragedy of plot, and the Oedipus at Colonus is more a tragedy of character. The Medea and the Hippolytus have a monstrous and ugly plot, but they are great because of the grand passion displayed by the heroines. Question 13. Tragedy would not be tragedy if it were not a painful mystery. How far can tragic experience be explained in terms of pain and mystery? Answer. Tragedy is the spectacle of the suffering of the heroes. Page 31. That sufferings are not physical but spiritual. Tragedy presents the painful conflict in the minds of the heroes. As Brutus says in Julius Caesar, quote, between the acting of a dreadful thing, and the first motion, all the interim is like a phantasma or a hidden dream. The genius and the mortal instruments are then in council, and the state of man, like to a little kingdom, suffers then the nature of an insurrection. Unquote. When the thought of murder occurs to Macbeth, his single state is so shaken that function is smothered in speculation. This is the internal conflict of the heroes and the pain resulting from it. Oedipus opposes those who come successively to accuse him of his sin, but his opposition gradually brings the pain of coming to grips with the truth. Creon and Antigone are locked in a conflict between two principles. The conflict assumes the alarming condition of conflict between two persons. Creon condemns Antigone to death, and he has to suffer the pain of seeing his son sharing the fate of Antigone. According to Bradley, Shakespearean tragedy is the story of the suffering and death of a great man. It is the story of exceptional suffering, ending in the most unfortunate death of a prince among men. These great men are faced with impossible situations. They stand aghast, being wrought. They are perplexed in the extreme. There is a marked one-sidedness in their nature, or they may be slaves to passion, but fate seems to guide them to their destiny. There is always the impression that some ironical, impalpable, malignant force leads them to the destined doom. Othello faces a Machiavellian villain like Iago. This is his fate. Hamlet, the humanist, idealist, is entangled in a milieu of corruptions. Even his mother and beloved are frail. Macbeth tries to prevent the inner forces that lead him to the murder, but they prove more powerful than his character. These impalpable supernatural forces create the painful mystery in the tragedies. In all tragedies, Nemesis or Furies or Arenas seem to dog the heroes and humiliate and torment them materially and mentally. The philosophic Hamlet says to the skeptical Horatio, quote, "There are more things in heaven and earth than your philosophy even dreams of." Unquote. Supernatural forces like the ghosts, omens, portents, and witches often appear in tragedy, intensifying the sense of mystery and fatalism. Macbeth meets the witches. He sees dagger pointing to the chamber of Duncan. Brutus sees the ghost of Caesar at the battlefield. Violent storms and pains occur on the night of Duncan's murder and Caesar's murder. They suggest the violent commotion in the moral world. They deepen the mystery and pain of tragedies. Page 32. Moreover, there is the mystery of characters. Tragedy creates the impression of waste. Bradley says, quote, "With Shakespeare, the pity and fear which are stirred by the tragic story seem to unite with and even to merge in a profound sense of sadness and mystery, which is due to this impression of waste." Unquote. The heroes are men of great possibilities. In their heroic resistances to the forces arrayed against them, they exhibit greatness of spirit. Macbeth, Othello, Hamlet are men of vast possibilities, but these are wasted in their defeat and death. But in the material plane, their life is a failure, but in the spiritual plane, their life is glorious. Our impression of futility and vanity of things equals our sense of splendor and magnificence. Bradley's concluding remark is worth quoting. Quote, "Tragedy is the typical form of this mystery because that greatness of soul which it exhibits oppressed, conflicting, and destroyed, is the highest existence in our view. It forces the mystery on us, and it makes us realize so vividly the worth of that which is wasted that we cannot possibly seek comfort in the reflection that all is vanity. Unquote. Question 14. What is dramatic irony? Examine its function in tragic drama. Answer. Broadly, there are two types of irony. There is ordinary irony, that is, intentional irony in speech, the speaker saying one thing to mean its reverse, using innocent language with an offensive motive. This is rhetorical or oratorical irony as opposed to dramatic or tragic irony. The classic example of this kind of irony is Antony's repeated assertions in Julius Caesar that, quote, Brutus is an honorable man, unquote. Aristotle never introduces the concept or the nature of tragic irony in his discussion of tragedy. But Sophocles and Shakespeare are masters of tragic irony. The change of fortune of the hero begins in ignorance, and the tragedy is completed when ignorance leads to knowledge. And these twin processes of peripety and discovery constitute what may be called tragic irony. Aristotle lays thus emphasis on the basic principle, the juxtaposition of cross purposes. In his elucidation of the tragic plot, in which men act contrary to their intentions or attain results that are the opposite of what they expect to attain, man seems to grope his way to knowledge, but he gropes in ignorance, and the discovery, the passage from ignorance to knowledge, is punctuated with frustrated expectations and unintended murders. Sophocles' protagonists have well-defined personalities, but their tragedy is independent of their characters. The tragic catastrophe comes quite unexpectedly. Continued in the next file.